Some of the earliest hominins, showing signs of bipedalism, were still very well built for climbing. That is the problem. If climbing still mattered, why did natural selection start favoring movement on two legs at all? The classic answer seems simple. Forests shrink, grasslands spread. Our ancestors come down from the trees. Standing upright helps them see farther, and two legs free the hands to carry food, babies, and eventually tools. It sounds complete. But that story predicts a clean sequence. Tree life declines first, bipedalism follows. The fossils do not give us that sequence. So the first thing to test is not how appealing the story sounds, but whether its timing works. If open grasslands triggered bipedalism, the oldest evidence should roughly fit. Around 6 million years ago, a hominin called Orrorin lived in what is now Kenya. We do not have a complete skeleton, but parts of its femur, the thigh bone, preserve clues about how weight passed through the hip and leg. The shape of those femora is widely interpreted as evidence that Orrorin had adaptations for bipedal movement. That does not mean it walked exactly like us, it does not tell us how often it used two legs, but it shows that some form of bipedal adaptation reaches very deep into the human lineage. There may be an even older clue. Around 6 million years ago, a hominin called Orrorin lived in what is now Kenya. We do not have a complete skeleton, but parts of its femur, the thigh bone, preserve clues about how weight passed through the hip and leg. The shape of those femora is widely interpreted as evidence that Orrorin had adaptations for bipedal movement. That does not mean it walked exactly like us, it does not tell us how often it used two legs, but it shows that some form of bipedal adaptation reaches very deep into the human lineage. There may be an even older clue. Sahelanthropus tchadensis lived around 7 million years ago in what is now Chad. Postcranial bones attributed to Sahelanthropus, including a partial femur and two ulnae, have been used to argue that it also showed signs of bipedalism. But that interpretation is still disputed. Some researchers think the bones support very early bipedal locomotion. Others argue that they are not enough to demonstrate habitual bipedal walking. That disagreement is important for one reason. The closer we get to the beginning of bipedalism, the more incomplete the evidence becomes. We may never find one fossil that lets us point to a single moment and say, this is when our ancestors became bipedal. And a better preserved hominin makes the simple story even harder. About 4.4 million years ago, Ardipithecus ramidus lived in Ethiopia. Its body did not fit neatly into a choice between climbing and walking. Parts of its pelvis and lower body are consistent with bipedal locomotion, but its foot and ankle also retained clear features linked to climbing. Recent work on the ankle has strengthened the case that vertical climbing was still an important part of its movement system. That gives us the first major reversal. Bipedalism did not instantly replace life in the trees. An early hominin could combine some form of upright walking with a body that still remained highly capable in an arboreal environment. That means coming down from the trees cannot be treated as the same event as becoming bipedal. And that changes how we should think about the environment. Many early hominin sites in Africa really were relatively open. Grasslands, shrublands, and open woodlands were important parts of the landscapes in which human evolution unfolded. But these were often mixed environments, not a clean switch from dense forest to endless grassland. So the strongest version of the old savanna story is too simple. Open habitats may still have changed the value of moving on the ground, but an environmental change by itself is not proof of why bipedalism began. We can test that simple prediction in a living ape. Chimpanzees in Tanzania's Issa Valley live in a relatively open savanna mosaic environment. If open landscapes automatically pushed apes toward much more ground-based bipedal walking, this population might be expected to show exactly that. Researchers did not find that simple pattern. That does not make chimpanzees stand-ins for our ancestors. They are not living fossils. But the comparison does show that simply placing an ape in a more open environment does not automatically produce a major shift toward terrestrial bipedalism. So perhaps some of the behavior that later became important on the ground had already been useful in the trees. Modern orangutans sometimes use upright or assisted bipedal postures on flexible branches. Standing more vertically can help them balance, reach, and shift their weight when four-limbed support is awkward. That makes tree-based upright behavior a real biological possibility. And Ardipithecus, with its mixture of climbing and bipedal features, makes that possibility worth taking seriously. But possibility is not the same as historical cause. This is where almost every neat origin story runs into trouble. A hypothesis has to pass two different tests. First, could the behavior actually provide a benefit? Second, do we have evidence that this benefit mattered when bipedalism first began evolving? Tree-based feeding can pass the first test. Carrying food can pass the first test. Standing taller can pass the first test. Freeing the hands can pass the first test. None of that proves which one, if any, started the transition. Then we reach one advantage that can be measured directly: energy. Human walking is remarkably economical. Experiments comparing humans and chimpanzees have shown that human-style bipedal walking can reduce the energetic cost of moving on the ground. At first, that sounds like the answer. If two legs save energy, maybe our ancestors became bipedal because walking upright was cheaper. But that creates a major logical trap. The efficient walking system we measure in modern humans is the result of millions of years of anatomical change. Our long legs, specialized feet, knees, pelvis, and trunk work together in a way that the earliest hominins did not necessarily share. So a benefit measured in the finished system cannot automatically explain why the earliest, less specialized form appeared. A feature can become very useful later without that same benefit being the reason it began. Evolution does not select a future goal. It cannot know that freeing the hands will someday help with sophisticated tools, or that a later foot will become better at long-distance walking. Natural selection can only favor variations that affect survival and reproduction under the conditions that exist at the time. So, whenever an explanation depends on a benefit that became important much later, we have to ask whether that benefit was actually available to the earlier body we are trying to explain. This is the third major shift in the story. The origin of bipedalism and the later refinement of bipedalism may not have had the same cause. To see why that matters, we need something more direct than another hypothesis. Around 3.66 million years ago, hominins walked across wet volcanic ash at Laetoli in what is now Tanzania. Their footprints survived. Bones usually tell us what a body may have been capable of doing. Footprints record an action that actually happened. The Laetoli tracks show that hominins were moving bipedally. They do not tell us the exact identity of every track maker. They do not reveal what those individuals were doing there, and they cannot settle every detail of gait. But they cross an important line. By 3.66 million years ago, bipedal locomotion was not only an anatomical possibility, it was a real behavior preserved in the ground. And the foot itself was changing too. Australopithecus afarensis, the species that includes the famous fossil Lucy, had a foot more clearly adapted to terrestrial bipedal locomotion than the much earlier Ardipithecus. A complete fourth metatarsal from A. afarensis supports the presence of a foot architecture better suited to supporting the body and acting as a relatively rigid platform during push-off. That does not mean its foot was identical to ours. It means that the bipedal system had changed. Now put the evidence side by side. Around 6 million years ago, Orrorin shows strong evidence of bipedal adaptation in the femur. By 4.4 million years ago, Ardipithecus combines bipedal features with substantial climbing adaptations. By 3.66 million years ago, Laetoli preserves actual bipedal walking. And later, Australopithecus anatomy shows a body becoming more committed to terrestrial bipedal movement. These fossils should not be arranged as a simple chain in which one species definitely became the next. But together they reveal something more useful. There was no single version of bipedalism. That matters because many famous explanations may be answering different questions. Carrying is one example. Walking upright leaves the hands available during locomotion, so carrying food, infants, or other objects could make bipedal behavior useful in some situations. But that describes a possible benefit. To turn it into an origin explanation, we would need evidence that carrying created enough selective advantage at the earlier stage to favor more bipedal anatomy. We do not currently have that direct evidence. The same applies to the idea of standing taller to see over vegetation. It may be useful in some situations. That is not evidence that it launched the entire transition. Tools are even weaker as an origin story. Bipedal adaptations appear far earlier than the later tool-making traditions people usually picture when they hear the phrase, freeing the hands. Thermoregulation has also been proposed as a possible benefit of upright posture in more open environments. But a plausible benefit is still not a demonstrated starting cause. The same caution applies to every attractive story. A behavior can be useful without being the original driver. A habitat can create an opportunity without acting as a single trigger. And a later anatomical advantage can tell us why a system was refined without telling us why its earliest version appeared. The mistake is assuming that all these theories have to compete for one single moment. What if there was no single moment? The earliest bipedal hominins still had bodies that retained major climbing abilities. In that stage, upright movement may have been useful in situations very different from those faced by later hominins that spent more time moving on the ground. Then the body changed. As terrestrial bipedalism became more important, stable support, efficient forward movement, and the structure of the foot and lower limb could matter more than they had before. Once the anatomy changes, the value of different behaviors changes too. A selective pressure that matters greatly in a later, more terrestrial hominin does not have to be the same pressure that mattered when a more limited form of bipedalism first appeared. And that leads to the biggest reveal. We usually imagine bipedalism as a switch. Before the switch, an ape-like ancestor on 4 limbs. After the switch, a human-like ancestor walking upright. But the fossil record does not show a switch. It shows different forms and degrees of bipedal adaptation. An early hominin could retain strong climbing abilities while also having anatomy consistent with upright movement. Millions of years later, other hominins show feet and lower limbs that were increasingly specialized for moving on the ground. Bipedalism itself evolved. That changes the question. Instead of asking what single event made our ancestors stand up once, we should ask how an initially limited form of bipedal movement became more important, more stable, and more deeply built into the body over millions of years. And once we ask it that way, the competing hypotheses stop looking like contestants fighting for one prize. A tree-based behavior could help explain why upright posture was useful in an early stage without explaining later terrestrial specialization. Open habitats could change the value of moving between scattered resources without acting as a single trigger. Energy efficiency could become increasingly important once hominins were already spending more time walking on the ground. Carrying could add another benefit without being the original cause. That does not mean every hypothesis is correct. The evidence does not let us divide the answer into neat percentages and say grasslands did this much, carrying did that much, and energy saving did the rest. We do not know that. What we do know is much more specific. Bipedal adaptations appeared very early in the human lineage. They existed alongside strong climbing adaptations for millions of years. By the time of the Laetoli footprints, hominins were clearly moving on 2 legs. And later, anatomy shows the foot and lower limb becoming more specialized for terrestrial bipedal locomotion. So, why did humans start walking on 2 legs? There is still no proven single trigger. The earliest form of bipedalism may have been useful in more than one context, and the evidence is not strong enough to identify one unique selective pressure that started everything. But we can say something stronger about what happened afterward. Bipedalism did not appear once in its modern form. It was repeatedly reshaped. As hominin bodies became more committed to movement on the ground, advantages such as economical locomotion could have become more important, even if they were not the reason the earliest bipedal adaptations appeared. So the best supported picture is not one ancestor suddenly discovering that 2 legs were better. It is a long evolutionary transition in which an early, limited form of upright movement existed in bodies that could still climb extremely well, then became increasingly central as anatomy and ecology changed. Eventually, bipedalism was no longer just one option in the movement system. It became the defining way our lineage moved across the ground. We can reconstruct much of that transformation from femurs, pelvises, feet, footprints, ancient environments, and experiments. But the very first selective pressure that made the earliest form of bipedalism worth keeping is still something the evidence cannot identify with certainty.